going to walk you through some of the basics that we learned in writing this book, This Abominable Slavery. Most of you may or may not be aware that on July 22nd, 2 days ahead of Brigham Young, 3 black enslaved men arrived in the Salt Lake Valley as a part of Orson Pratt's advance party. 42 men and 23 wagons. They camp the first encampment, 1700 south and 500 east. And then by July 24th, they have moved north between present-day 300 and 400 south and State and Main Street, and they are plowing and planting by the time Brigham Young arrives on July 24th. Salt Lake Valley, in other words, was established and built in part by enslaved labor. Their white enslavers sent them ahead in 1847 to build shelters and plant crops so that when the white enslavers arrived in 1848, they had a place to live and food to eat. We also might be aware that the Ute were engaging in slave trafficking, raiding from Goshute and Southern Paiute women and children, and selling them to the Spanish. Now you have the arrival of permanent Euro-Americans, and within a few months of the Latter-day Saint arrival in 1847, a Ute trafficker named Baptiste showed up in the Latter-day Saint camp with a couple of teenage Native American children and offered them to the Latter-day Saints. The Latter-day Saints denied the offer, and the Ute trafficker said, "If you don't buy them, I'll kill them," according to Latter-day Saint sources. Latter-day Saints didn't believe Baptiste, and he killed one of the children. And in response, the Latter-day Saints purchased the other one. And so they are also quickly drawn into Native American slavery within a few months of their arrival. And so both are issues that they are dealing with. Day that they arrive, African American slavery is in what will become Utah Territory, and Native American enslavement predates their arrival. So those are questions that the Latter-day Saints will be forced to deal with, and they do so in 1852 in their legislative session. So what are the origins of this study? I was doing research for my book, Religion of a Different Color, and trying to get to the bottom of when Brigham Young said what about the racial, priesthood, and temple restrictions within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I made a request at the Church History Library for a Pittman shorthand version of Brigham Young's 5th of February, 1852 speech. And that request ended up turning up a folder full of speeches recorded by George Watt, the legislative recorder for the territorial legislature. He took notes in Pittman shorthand, a 19th century version of shorthand that let the recorder pretty much capture verbatim what was being said. Those speeches were written down by Watt. His typical method would then be to transcribe his own shorthand into longhand, and that's more often than not how those speeches got published in the Deseret News or what was called the Journal of Discourses. The speeches he recorded for the legislative session, however, he did not transcribe. They sat in his collection from 1852 until 2013, when my question prompted then the discovery of this folder, and Legine Purcell Caruth, who works for the Church History Department, transcribes Pittman shorthand. That's her job day in and day out, transcribing Pittman shorthand. She then transcribed all of these speeches, and we then had a burst of new evidence upon which to write our book. And all of those speeches, like Kim mentioned, are publicly available on a website at the University of Utah, thisabominableslavery.org. Anyone can read the primary sources upon which we based our narrative history. And that's with the full cooperation of the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I'll be sharing quotes. This is just an example of what the Pitman, one page of the Pitman looks like. Okay, and that's what Legene works with day in and day out, transcribing them into longhand. Okay, so it's important then to establish what we mean by antebellum Utah. This is the pre-Civil War period, and historians of the 1850s describe one central question perplexing the nation. Can human beings be held as property? Northerners will look to the ideals of the founding of the nation and simply say that's a violation of the founding principles of this nation, and the answer is no. Southerners will look to the Constitution and say, in fact, the Constitution protects property rights and protects our right to hold human beings as property. That question is ultimately not resolved without the loss of over 600,000 lives in a civil war. What we address in this book is simply Utah's answer, or attempts to answer that same question. Can human beings be held as property? We have then the minutes of the 1852 legislative session and a variety of speeches from that legislative session that have now come to light. So just a flood of new evidence. So we know what legislators were thinking. It's an all Latter-day Saint legislature, and heavily represented amongst those legislators are Latter-day Saint leaders. And there's a mixture of church and state going on. Religion is infused into the conversations. And Brigham Young will first publicly articulate a race-based priesthood and temple restriction for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in this legislative session. So they're mixing religion with politics in this legislative session. And I'll focus in on the debate that takes place between Brigham Young and Orson Pratt. Brigham Young is the leader of his faith as well as territorial governor. Orson Pratt is a legislator in the territorial legislature as well as an apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So those roles are overlapping, and they don't see any distinction between overlapping those roles. Okay. We also then have newly transcribed speeches from the 1856 Utah Constitutional Convention. Utah applies a second time for statehood in 1856. And one delegate at that convention, Seth Blair from the South, proposes that application be explicitly as a slave state to protect the enslaved people, the property rights of white enslavers over their enslaved people who have been brought to Utah territory. That produces another debate about slavery. That proposal is soundly rejected, and we have a roll call vote, 26-5, voted down. Utah will not send an application as a slave state. It's for its second attempt at being admitted into the United States, but it produces another debate, and I'll share a quote from Orson Pratt from one of his strident anti-slavery speeches. So that gives you a little bit of context of what we're talking about, and I thought for our conversation tonight it would just be useful to maybe shape it around ideas expressed by Brigham Young, territorial governor, and by Orson Pratt, legislator and Latter-day Saint apostle, because these two men are most dramatically squaring off in this 1852 legislative session. So I've organized the presentation around what did Brigham Young say about slavery, the curse of Cain, and voting rights, and what did Orson Pratt say about slavery, the curse of Cain, and voting rights. They all come through in the speeches from this legislative session. So first of all, slavery. Brigham Young will open the legislative session with a speech that is pre-written. So this one actually was published in the Deseret News and in the legislative minutes. It was written in advance. The other speeches that are captured by Watt were extemporaneous. Okay? The first speech is Brigham Young trying to establish the agenda for the legislative session as governor. Okay? And so one part of that speech is dedicated to the question of both African and Native American enslavement in Utah Territory. And Brigham Young is certainly aware of that question ripping the nation apart, pulling it asunder in the 1850s. Can human beings be held as property? And he says, it is unnecessary, perhaps, for me to indicate the true policy for Utah in regard to slavery. Restrictions of law and government make all servants, but human flesh to be dealt in as property is not consistent or compatible with the true principles of government. My own feelings are that no property can or should be recognized as existing in slaves, either Indian or African. So on the surface, it seems like, Brigham Young is telling us he's against the principle that human beings can be held as property. Now, what passes in this legislative session frees no one then enslaved. But Brigham Young believes what passes does not equate to chattel slavery or human beings as property. What we have to do is recover a 19th century context. Today we think in stark categories of free and enslaved. In the 19th century, there's a spectrum of unfree categories. We have indentured servitude, apprenticeships, slavery, chattel slavery, servitude, right? So Brigham Young himself was apprenticed. A lot of the legislatures are familiar with these unfree labor categories because they grew up with them. And they are looking backwards to the unfree labor categories they're familiar with. Legislator Orson Pratt is looking forward, representing a free labor ethic in Utah Territory. And for him, those various distinctions all equate to a form of slavery. And so that's the nature of the debate that will play out in this legislative session. Brigham Young doesn't believe that human beings can be held as property, but what passes the legislature frees no one then enslaved. Okay? It grants them some rights, and if you have some rights, you're not mere property. But it frees no one then enslaved. Okay, so let's continue with one of the extemporaneous speeches that Brigham Young gives, and it's going to seemingly contradict what he says in his opening speech, okay? So on the 23rd of January, one of the speeches that has been transcribed by Legene, I am a firm believer in slavery. I think it is reasonable according to the revelations. The Lord has revealed that the children of man are to be agents to themselves and to the Lord their God. Many brethren in the South have means vested in slaves. Those of their servants want to come here, but when they come here, the devil is raised. This one talking, that one talking, and a strong abolitionist feeling prevails with some people, whispering, etc., saying, do you think it is right? I'm afraid it is not right. I know it is right. There should be a law made to have the slaves serve their masters because they are not capable of ruling themselves. Brigham Young will articulate basically a paternalistic notion. Those of Black African ancestry are incapable of governing themselves. There's this white paternalism that is articulated by Southern enslavers, and Brigham Young will adopt that as a part of his philosophy. Black people are incapable of ruling themselves, biologically, racially incapable of ruling themselves, and so there's this need for white paternalism, okay? I would like masters to treat well their servants and to see what every person in the territory is well used. When a master has a Negro and uses him well, he is better off than if he was free, Brigham Young says. And so what the legislature produces, I'll give you a couple of examples of why in Brigham Young's mind he believes what they produce does not equate to human beings as property. Section 7 of the bill stipulates that a master or mistress are not able to sell one of their enslaved people without the consent of the enslaved. And it has to be given to a probate judge in the absence of the master or mistress. If you have consent, you're not property. You have some rights, okay? Section 8, any person who is transferring a servant or servant contrary to the provisions of this act or taking one out of the territory can't do so contrary to the will of the enslaved. If you have consent, you are not mere property. So you're granting enslaved people some rights that they wouldn't have held had they been in chattel slavery in the South, and therefore we're not talking about human beings as property, but we're not freeing anyone then enslaved. Okay? And he explicitly changes the name of the bill from an act in relation to slavery to an act in relation to service. Okay? And he calls it servitude, even though he's never distinct, and he'll slip between slavery and servitude in some of his speeches. The other thing that the bill does is it criminalizes white masters having sexual relations with their enslaved. And if you're familiar with enslavement in the South, you have rape taking place, and you have white enslavers enslaving their own children as a result. And the bill is designed to prevent that. It criminalizes white masters having sexual relations with their enslaved, and it also criminalizes any sexual intercourse with any white person in the African race. It also then specifies that the enslaved in Utah Territory, the black enslaved in Utah Territory, are to be sent to school not less than 18 months between the age of 6 years and 20 years. If you're familiar with chattel slavery in the South, it explicitly prevents education for black enslaved. Knowledge is power. And you cannot legally educate your enslaved in the South. So there are distinctions bound up in Utah's bill. And in Brigham Young's mind, this doesn't equate to human beings as property, but once again, it's not freeing anyone then enslaved. Okay, so what does Orson Pratt have to say about slavery? When the bill is first read to the legislative session, he moves that the bill be rejected in total. He doesn't want it introduced, slavery, servitude, whatever you're going to call it, I want it rejected. That's Orson Pratt's proposal. Shall we introduce this evil in our midst? No. I hope there is wisdom, light, and intelligence enough within the bosoms of this honorable council to spurn the idea with indignation, Orson Pratt says. Shall we assume the right without the voice of the Lord speaking to us and commanding us to introduce slavery into our territory? So once again, they're mixing religious ideas with political ideas, but Orson Pratt is suggesting there is no revelation telling us to do this, to use Latter-day Saint language. We haven't been commanded by God to do it. We're violating his principles. He gives a very strident anti-slavery speech. And we believe as a result of that speech, even though the bill still passes, an important modification is made. We found the original version of the bill and then the bill that passes, and you can see 18 crucial words are scratched out of the original bill before it actually passes. Those 18 words would have passed on the condition of servitude to the next generation, meaning that enslaved parents, their children, would have inherited their condition. But because of Orson Pratt's speech, we believe they cross out those 18 lines, meaning the condition of servitude doesn't pass on to the parents, making it a very conservative form of gradual emancipation. Meaning, if you arrive in Utah Territory enslaved, including children, you, according to this bill, can die enslaved. You can be held in condition of servitude for life. But children born after arrival to enslaved parents would then be free. The condition would not pass to them. A conservative form of gradual emancipation. And we believe that's in response to Orson Pratt's strident anti-slavery speech. Okay, once again, religion is getting mixed in here, and Brigham Young will first articulate a race-based priesthood and temple restriction publicly in this legislative session. And he will draw upon what he calls the curse of Cain, an idea that predates the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by several centuries, part of the broader Judeo-Christian tradition, he will now bring it into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and give it theological weight. He says in one of his speeches on the 5th of February, the Lord told Cain that he should not receive the blessings of the priesthood until the last of the posterity of Abel had received the priesthood. So Brigham Young believes that black people are descendants of Cain and that white people are descendants of Abel. Cain killed Abel. Because Cain killed Abel, all of Abel's supposed descendants will need to receive the Latter-day Saint priesthood before any of Cain's supposed descendants can receive the priesthood. So if there never was a prophet or apostle of Jesus Christ who spoke it before, claiming to be the first prophet of the Latter-day Saint restoration to say this, he admits it, he's the first. If there never was a prophet or apostle of Jesus Christ who spoke it before, I tell you, this people that are commonly called Negroes are the children of Cain. I know they are, I know they cannot bear rule in the priesthood in the first sense of the word. Orson Pratt, once again, very different perspective. Brigham Young is defining people of black African ancestry as inherently cursed. It's a violation of a founding principle of the Latter-day Saint faith. Joseph Smith, the founder of the faith, articulates in the second article of faith that men will be punished for their own sins, not for Adam's transgression. Brigham Young is holding the supposed descendants of Cain accountable for a murder in which they took no part. So listen to how Orson Pratt is defining them in distinction. Shall we take then the innocent African? Orson Pratt is describing them as innocent. Brigham Young inherently cursed. Okay? Theological distinction. Shall we take then the innocent African that has committed no sin and damn him to slavery and bondage without receiving any authority from heaven to do so? He found the idea preposterous and said it was enough to cause the angels in heaven to blush. In his 1856 anti-slavery speech, he goes even further. We have no proof that the Africans are the descendants of old Cain who was cursed. And even if we had that evidence, we have not been ordered to inflict that curse upon that race. Once again, appealing to the notion of revelation, God has not given us any authority to do this, and black people are not descendants of Cain. Hopefully it goes without saying in 2025, Orson Pratt is correct. There's also a debate over voting rights. Orson Pratt actually proposes that black men be allowed to vote in 1852 Utah Territory. Brigham Young will reject this idea as well. Again, to the principle of men bearing rule, not one of the children of old Cain has any right to bear rule in government affairs from the first to last. They have no business there. And he expands beyond those of African descent for those who he believes should be barred from voting in Utah Territory. We must admit that if thousands come from the Pacific Islands, 10 or 15,000 from Japan or from China, not one soul of them would come here and know how to vote. They would not know the first thing to do in government affairs. In Mexican territory, there is not a man there who knows how to legislate there for the benefit of the people. They know no more about voting or dictating than a jackass does, Brigham Young says. We just as well make a bill here for mules to vote as Negroes or Indians, he will say. You cannot find within men upon the earth who are of the seed of Cain any that possess knowledge and sensibility enough to vote. What we are trying to do today is to make the Negro equal with us in all of our privileges. My voice shall be against it all the day long, Brigham Young says. Orson Pratt, in response, will vote against all acts prohibiting the right of Negroes the privilege of voting. And after Brigham Young gives that strident speech on the morning of the 5th of February, 1852, there are two rubber stamp bills that are introduced into the legislature, the Cedar City and Fillmore, Utah incorporation bills. These are just typically rubber stamped by the legislature. Orson Pratt votes against both, and the legislative minutes tells us he does so on the ground that colored people were there prohibited from voting. So it's his way of pushing back again against Brigham Young after he gives that very strident speech. In the morning of the 5th of February, Orson Pratt is voting no on the Cedar City and Fillmore incorporation bills, once again rejecting Brigham Young's ideas. Okay, so that gives you just an overview then of an act in relation to service, the Black Servant Code. And I should say then that we have a very small number of people of Black African ancestry who are enslaved in Utah Territory for the duration of this bill. It passes in 1852. Remember, legislatures are attempting to govern the relationship between white enslavers and their Black enslaved. At its height in 1851, there are 56 enslaved people in Utah Territory. A group of those leave and go to California and help to establish San Bernardino. For the decade that this bill is in force, between 1852 and 1862, there are roughly between 30 and 40 Black enslaved people in Utah Territory. Okay. The other enslavement that the legislature is dealing with are the enslavement of Native peoples. And roughly 400 Native peoples will be brought into Latter-day Saint homes by the end of the 19th century. Okay. And so we can talk then about what the legislature passes. For Native Americans, the legislature will pass indentures for up to 20 years. So Native American children who are brought into Latter-day Saint homes can be indentured for up to a maximum of 20 years. There are various ways that they might come into Latter-day Saint homes. Like I mentioned, Ute traffickers are sometimes bringing Southern Paiute and Gauche Ute women and children to Latter-day Saints and suggesting that they purchase them. Sometimes Latter-day Saints are just actively engaged in the trade themselves and going to Southern Paiute or Gauche Ute and bargaining for them. Sometimes they are prisoners of war and taken in that capacity. And so you have a variety of ways in which they might come into Latter-day Saint homes, and this law is designed to govern the relationship and defines then a limit of 20 years of indenture. It uses the language of apprenticeship. The ideal of the bill is that those who are brought into Latter-day Saint homes under this indenture bill will bring them up in some avocation, some trade, so that when their indenture is over, ideally they can integrate and have a skill in which they can provide for themselves as they integrate into white society. Now, it doesn't always play out ideally in practice, but that's the basis of the bill. And like with the act in relation to service, there is a provision that requires that the master send the indentured Native American to school. The requirement for Native American children is for 3 months in each year between the ages of 7 years and 16. So higher education requirements for Native American children than for African American enslaved. Orson Pratt also wants this bill rejected. He says Latter-day Saints should respond out of humanitarian impulses if Native Americans are brought to them, but he doesn't care if it's 20-year indenture. He says he still equates it to a form of slavery. It is buying and selling, Orson Pratt says. Though it may not continue down through other generations, yet it is binding the Indians to slavery for at least 20 years. When we touch the principle of enslaving the Aborigines of this country, binding them by certain laws to be bought and sold, it is preposterous, and I wonder why any gentleman present would bring such a bill, Orson Pratt says, and argues for its rejection as well. Okay. So once again, remember, he is representing the free labor ethic that is coming in across the nation, and the other legislators are looking backward to the unfree labor categories they're most familiar with. The bill passes, and we've found 2 examples of Native American servant registrations, one in Sanpete County, one in Iron County. I'm sure there are more out there in county archives if they haven't been destroyed, but those are the ones that we found. The bill requires a person who is acquiring a Native American child to take it to a probate judge and register it with a probate judge and stipulate the number of years that that person will be held in servitude. And it also then requires that the master, like I said, provide an education for them and then provide freedom dues, a suit of clothing when they live up to their servitude agreement. Okay, so that gives you an overview of those two laws that pass in Utah Territory. How long do they last? It's an open question that we are not able to answer firmly, but one potential answer is 10 years. The Republican Party, remember in 1856, a founding plank of the Republican Party, when it runs its first presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, it says that it is the right and imperative duty of Congress to prohibit in the territories the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. And guess what? Politicians actually kept their word. In 1862, when Republicans gained control of Congress, remember the Democrats in the South secede from the Union, the Civil War is going on, and Republicans are left in charge, they actually fulfill that promise. Within a couple of weeks of each other, they passed the first anti-polygamy bill in 1862, and this act, an act to secure freedom to all persons within the territories of the United States, meaning the freeing of enslaved peoples in all U.S. territories. Remember, Abraham Lincoln wins election on the promise that he will not free the slaves in the states. And yet the South still secedes from the Union. Why do they do so? Because they're afraid that it will be shut down in the West. The Republican Party has said they will prohibit slavery in the territories. And if you prohibit in the territories, all you're going to do is add new free states into the nation. And before long, the South will lose the balance of power and you'll outlaw slavery where it then exists. So the line in the sand is the West for Southerners. And Lincoln and the Republicans make good on their promise, and in 1862, they ban polygamy and slavery in the territories. So this is the more than likely, as far as we can determine, the legal end of Utah's act in relation to service. But does anyone know about it, is the open question. We find Utah's territorial delegate, John Bernheisel, writing a letter to Brigham Young saying, hey, the law against polygamy, it looks like it's going to pass, and there's a law banning slavery in the territories as well. So Brigham Young is aware. And on the 2nd of July, 1862, the Deseret News runs a column under News from Washington, in which it's buried on page 4. And in the middle of the column, you can see here, this is the announcement. On June 20th, the president approved the bill prohibiting slavery in the territories. That's it. There's no banner headline. There's no celebration. Does this word make it out to white enslavers, let alone to their black enslaved? The 13th Amendment, prohibiting slavery everywhere, will pass at the end of the Civil War in 1865. We don't know when Utah's enslaved are ostensibly set free. There's no evidence that survives that we can put our fingers on. And so legally, Utah's Juneteenth is June 20th, 1862. This would have eradicated that act in relation to service if legislators believed that it actually outlaws that. Remember, they believe that they are passing a form of servitude, not slavery. It prohibits in the territories involuntary servitude and slavery. Okay, and the law technically uses consent, and so they could have suggested that this doesn't have an impact on the bill that we passed. The bill that they passed remains on the books at least until 1866, when it disappears from Utah's law code. The Act for the Relief of Indian Slaves and Prisoners disappears from Utah's law code by 1876. But like I said, there are all kinds of evidence that Latter-day Saints continue to take Native children into their homes up through the turn of the 20th century. Roughly 400 brought into Latter-day Saint homes, and they're just doing it by custom. The law is eradicated after 1876, but they continue to do it by custom. Okay. So, what is the lasting legacy of this legislative session then? And this will tie it into Holladay. After a decade, Congress overruled Brigham Young's approach to slavery in the territories, but his position against priesthood ordination in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints lasted for nearly 130 years and became so entrenched in Latter-day Saint belief and practice that it required God to overrule him. But not until 1978. And that brings me then to Abner Leonard Howell. This will tie us into Holladay history. Abner comes to Utah with his family from Louisiana. His parents were enslaved. And they move west looking for work, and his father actually becomes one of the first black police officers in Salt Lake and the first black police detective in Salt Lake. Abner will graduate from Salt Lake High School in 1900. He's a star athlete, a member of the football team. He will then attend the University of Michigan Law School. Unfortunately, he is not able to keep up with tuition. He has to drop out because he doesn't have money to pay for law school. He meets and marries his wife, Nina, in Michigan, and they return to Utah in 1910 as a married couple with their two oldest children. He will work as a brick mason, and he will raise his 8 children in Holladay. They will arrive in Holladay in 1920. The 1920 census counts 2,600 people in Holladay, and they are the only black family in the entire community in the 1920 census. In 1921, Abner and his wife Nina, their 2 oldest children in 1915, have already joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They will follow along in 1921. And this is their membership record in the Holladay ward. And you can see in parentheses next to both of their names the word colored. White membership records are not notated, but those of black African ancestry frequently are. Clerks can't help but note with the word colored or sometimes Negro or Negro blood in the margins of the documents they create in Latter-day Saint membership records, and that's true for both Nina and Abner. They will raise their entire children in the Latter-day Saint faith. When they turn 8, they are dutifully baptized into the Latter-day Saint faith. Nina will die in 1945, and Abner will then marry Green Flake. So Green Flake was one of those 3 black enslaved men who arrives on July 22nd. His granddaughter will marry Abner as his second wife, and it's her second spouse. She's widowed at the time, and so they get married, and they remain practicing Latter-day Saints and actually serve an unofficial mission for the LDS Church in 1951. They're sent across the South to survey the conditions of Black Latter-day Saints. Are there enough to create segregated congregations is what they're sent to survey. They will meet Len and Mary Hope in Ohio, who have been rejected by their white congregants in Ohio who refused to allow them to worship with them. Abner and Martha will help resolve that situation and report back to Salt Lake. He is active in the NAACP, in the Boy Scouts, very much community-minded and very much an active participant in civic affairs for the rest of his life. In terms of dealing with the Latter-day Saint priesthood restriction, Abner will say, the priesthood doesn't save you. You can get to the highest degree of the celestial kingdom, Latter-day Saint notions of the afterlife, without the priesthood. I don't know why I should live the life that I've led, he will say, other than the fact that I have been called of the Lord to lead the life I've led. I have more friends in Salt Lake City because I always walk down the straight and narrow path, doing the right thing. His bio and Nina's bio are available at centuryofblackmormons.org, a website I oversee at the University of Utah, where we are naming, identifying every person of Black African ancestry baptized into the LDS faith between 1830 and 1930. Abner and Nina's bios were done by Tanya Ryder, who works with Century of Black Mormons. And her conclusion is that in many respects, Abner's life represents the leadership capacity that his chosen faith lost in the wake of its racial teachings and policies. Very much a leader, and those racial teachings and policies prevented him from being a leader in the Latter-day Saint faith. The Holladay Ward did invite him and named him an unofficial member of the High Priest group, a priesthood organization there, and he would attend, but obviously unordained. And those were the ways they tried to help him feel welcome, but nonetheless couldn't overcome the racial restrictions, and he doesn't live long enough to see those restrictions lifted. So that, in other words, is the lasting legacy of that 1852 legislative session. Congress overrules Brigham Young by 1862. It takes until 1978 for the Latter-day Saint faith to get rid of the racial restrictions that were first publicly articulated in that legislative session. Thank you.